Hi everybody, my name is Brian McConaghy. I'm the founding director of Ratanak International, and today I'm going to be speaking on God as the God of justice. And I'm going to be using basically my own story and the story of our work in Cambodia with human trafficking victims to illustrate this, and then tie it up with sort of an understanding of what is the demands God makes of us in terms of justice. So I'm not going to do more of an introduction of me right now, because we're going to get right into that actually in the presentation. I'm going to be starting with me. So here I am. This is the package God started with. And like you, as you grow up, there's no particular skills at all of any sort. And so I was a kid growing up in Belfast in Northern Ireland. I had a lot of weaknesses. I was a dyslexic kid. I was academically challenged is an understatement. I was a failure academically, actually. And I also existed in an environment that was very violent. The troubles in Ireland were very much ongoing, and so these were my climbing frames and where I spent my weekends and my spare time goofing around with soldiers, learning to play with their rifles, and that was my environment. Very foreign to Canada. But the violence of society sort of translated into a lot of violence in the school system as well. And being the dyslexic kid, I was completely uncoordinated and a failure at sports. Given the fact I couldn't read either, I was very much picked on and beaten up a lot and beaten unconscious on occasions. And so you end up becoming this pretty bitter, angry, withdrawn kid with no particular skills of any sort. I'm the kind of kid you can read about in the news that if things go wrong, they can end up doing homicides. Just, the slide was happening for me. And so this is one of the rare pictures of me as a teenager. This is not what you think of in terms of Christian missions. This is a kid that's headed in the wrong direction. But the interesting thing about God is he so often takes our weaknesses and he turns them into strengths if we allow him. So even though I was dyslexic, and that had all kinds of disadvantages, there are huge advantages to many of the disabilities we have. There's always a flip side that God can use. And so for me, it was a visual memory. I'm still a hopeless reader and speller, but I have this incredible visual memory. And so I can memorize these kind of shapes, and I knew weapons back to front. Weapons for me were a source of strength, how you defend yourself, that sort of very vulnerable position I was in Ireland. I loved hanging around soldiers and police with machine guns, etc., because that was power. And I could remember all these things, and God just wired me that way. So much so that, to make a very long story short, when we emigrated to Canada, the RCMP actually pursued me as a weapons specialist because of the knowledge I had available to me. That's a long story I won't get into. And I ended up doing forensic science as a firearms specialist, and sort of doing all the CSI stuff you see on TV, and it's gory stuff, but my real skill set is weapons. I was also a trained sniper, and my particular skill set is working with dead people in the morgue. How are they killed? What do they have to say in their death? And what do the wounds tell me, etc.? So if you want a completely useless skill set for Christian missions, it's a guy who is a weapons specialist who specializes in particular with dead people. This is a non-starter for Christian missions, and yet this is exactly the package of weakness and brokenness that God would use. I think really the only thing I brought to the table was I was willing to be used by him. And I had a broken heart for those who were downtrodden, because I know what that feels like. I know what it is to be rejected. And God uses that. So if there's elements of your life where there's negatives there, don't presume God cannot do something powerful with them. He can redeem even the worst things that happen to us. Doesn't mean to say there's not scars and there's not torment in some of that, but he can redeem it and even bless others. So as my career carried on, I ended up responsible for some very difficult files. One of them I spent years on was the Willie Pickton file, serial killer outside of Vancouver. And this was a man who killed, we figure, 49 young women and processed them as meat. An absolutely grotesque case where for the first time I was confronted with this kind of serial dehumanization of young women. This is me working in the slaughterhouse where the young women were killed and dismembered, and inside his freezer looking for forensic evidence on the walls. And in doing this file and in being responsible for the body parts, the heads, the feet, the hands, the ribs, all that kind of stuff of the young women, I got to know many of these young women, not in life obviously, but in death, in learning about them, in studying them. And I, for the first time in my life, was confronted by prostitution, which is a form of human trafficking and slavery. And I was appalled at how abused these women were and how they really had no chance. They were controlled by pimps, etc. But what was astonishing in some of these women, just to discover as I researched them, even though I have body parts right there, I realize as I stare at one face I can remember very well, in particular her head, and she was a Christian sister of mine. And I will see her one day. She belongs to the Lord, and that was very, very clear. And so now it becomes very personal that God was working even in the lives of these prostituted, trafficked young women. How do I deal with that? How do I confront that whole new ugly world? It was while working that file, as God broke my heart for those that were prostituted, that the Vancouver City Police approached me. It was a joint task force. We were working side by side. I was RCMP. They were VPD. And the VPD guy said, we've got another investigation where a guy is assaulting many women downtown Eastside and torturing them and videoing his torture sessions. And if you're wondering about how dark my world is, yeah, this is the world I've lived in. It's a dark, dark world. That's where God wants me to work. Anyway, so the VPD approached me and they said, we want you to look at some videos because this guy's torturing prostituted women. But in amongst the torture victims, I think there was 63, 67 victims, we have little children. And so these were sex torture tapes. And I agreed to assist them because these were Asian kids. And they said, you go to Asia a lot. Why don't you take a look at these and see if you can tell us what country these kids are from? And I stepped into a whole new ugly world. It just kept getting deeper and deeper. I thought serial homicides were as bad as it could get. Nothing prepared me for child assault and child abuse of this sort. And so as God would plan it, God introduced me to these 7 little lives that were to completely change me. And that was profound for me to see what was being done for them and opened up the world of child abuse and child prostitution in Asia. Absolutely grotesque. And so God threw the gauntlet down. He didn't give me a choice. I'm looking at this video. I'm being confronted by these images, and I'm listening to the soundtrack of these children and these tortured women. And God saying, what are you going to do with this? Nobody wants to see this stuff. Nobody wants to absorb such corrosive stuff into their mind, and yet God was saying, I have a job for you. And so in fear and trembling, without feeling I had any skills, we set about investigations in Cambodia. That's where these children were from. And so we started working with the Cambodian police, and not many Christian agencies are thrilled to work with the Cambodian police. They're viewed as notoriously corrupt. And yet, if we choose to work with them, we discovered that there were men there that had their own kids. They had a heart for children. And so we could work with them, and we ended up working quite a few investigations. We were executing search warrants and solving crimes. Many of those were brought to court in Canada. And so here I find myself now as a Christian weapons specialist working for the living, where God has changed this to the point where He demands of me that I work for those that are completely downtrodden, those that have so few human rights that they're actually considered product. They are sold as a product, as a slave. And so this was inspiring to me and led to my full-time work with Ratanak International on the Cambodian side. The work with the children led to an understanding of the far greater industry, and that is the industry of sort of the mid-teens and up, who are abused in so many ways, both in terms of prostitution domestically in Cambodia, but also we discovered that they were being sold overseas. And a vulnerable country like Cambodia that does not have the infrastructure of some other countries as a result of genocide, civil war in their past. They're still rebuilding. They were very vulnerable to organized crime. And just north of Cambodia, you have China that because of one-child policy and gender preference, they are 35 million females short. There's your market. And we have a recipe for one of the worst forms of human trafficking that exists, and that's the transportation of young women en masse to meet the needs of those in China who have 35 million young men without any prospect of girlfriends or wives, and you can imagine where that goes. Needless to say, all the nice guys, all the wealthy guys, all the sensitive, tender guys get the girlfriends, get the wives in China. Who's left? It's the deviant, it's the violent, it's the criminal. All the guys left over do not have the wives, and so this is where the product is sold. The human trafficking goes into China, and so many young lives in Cambodia are sold, particularly to China, but elsewhere as well. And sometimes they're sold for domestic help, domestic jobs, house cleaning, etc. Frequently that involves physical abuse. These are just a couple of stills from a video. Obviously I'm not going to show you the video here, but this is just an average. This particular young woman, I believe, is in Malaysia, and this is the mom of the household who disagrees with the young girl who has obviously there's some infraction there in terms of how she's been cleaning the house, and so she is beaten and finds herself on the floor begging that the beating stops. This is the level of trauma before we even get into sexual abuse, before we get into slavery in that form. The level of violence is huge. And so what these young women experience leads to a desperation to escape. They have been sold as product and they have no way home. Yet they jump out of windows. They roll out of moving cars. We had one recently that swam through the sewers. I mean, these lives are like movies. They are so desperate to get out from the abuse. And so we have a team in Cambodia now that becomes aware of these files and assists them getting back. And part of the assistance involves a legal process. As you know, nobody gets out of China or any country really without a passport, but particularly China, you don't get out without an exit visa. If the traffickers have destroyed your paperwork when they arrived and sold you in China, you're de facto illegal there and you can't get out. And so it's a tragedy for these young people. They can escape and then go right into prison. So we started working with the Cambodian government at their request to assist them with negotiations internationally. And so we have now become subject matter experts in this, where we can assist the Cambodian government in bilateral negotiations so that we can transport young women and young men from other countries back to Cambodia on temporary papers without the normal visas. That's a legal protocol, an immigration protocol that's been established. And isn't it wonderful that along here in the back row as subject matter experts, we have young Christians advising on international law, on immigration, on correct therapeutic mechanisms by which we can transport traumatized young people safely. What a joy that is to have the Ratanak team doing this and see where God has taken the weakness of a young teenager in Belfast who was completely downtrodden, but given a heart for those downtrodden. And here's where we find ourselves working internationally with governments. So once agreements are reached in terms of getting those young lives out, we have a center close to the airport, and the young women fly in and are greeted by our staff. And these are just a couple of pictures of real live slaves just arriving. And this is the first probably 45 minutes to an hour of freedom these two young women have experienced as they're welcomed by Ratanak staff into the center. The trauma is profound for them. They don't know when they first meet us if they're being re-trafficked. They're compliant because they've been beaten to the point where they are compliant in the past. And so they generally will get in the van quite readily, but they're worried and they're taken to our center. And oftentimes the first real step to them realizing they're free is we cook for them whatever they want, whatever their favorite food is that they've missed sometimes for years overseas. And our staff care for them and love them and just pour it on. And very quickly they realized, yes, I am loved. And of course that translates right into, if I am loved by these people, why? Well, you're loved because you were made in the image of God and you are precious, and that gets communicated to them. So it's a very exciting process, if initially traumatic for them to go to our center because they don't know who the traffickers are or aren't. And so there they can relax and they meet other young women who have been trafficked the same way and they realize they are safe. What a gift to be able to give them as we attempt to rebuild their lives. So there's extensive trauma counseling and sort of reintegration with families where possible. This is just one illustration. This is a young woman that was trafficked at 17 to Malaysia and placed in a brothel servicing Western males. She had no way out. She did run away and lived on the street, being abused there, and eventually found her way back to Cambodia. And the only story she had of hope was the fact that there was, when she was 45 days old, there was a mom that loved her before she was taken from the mom, and taken by force from the mom. And so our staff went about 17 years on, tracking and finding that mom. And this is a picture of their first meeting. This is mom and the daughter, and they're meeting for the first time. And one of the things the daughter was really interested in was, why are we doing this? And so to be able to express to her that there is a God that cherishes that reunification, that values her profoundly, where nobody else has valued her, is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And so she launched into a Bible study with our staff and the other young women in the center, experiencing for the first time that she has value. What a joy. There's the therapeutic side. There's also the side that involves the future of life. I mean, you can't just put somebody through therapy and then throw them back on the street where they've got nothing. They're going to be trafficked again because there's no social services that we would understand in Canada. And so they learn the usual skills around the house in terms of our center, but that turns into external training and very active education and training for their future, which leads to jobs. And so we have many young women now with good jobs, jobs of dignity and jobs of hope. And with income comes stature. And with stature comes the sense of self-worth and dignity, that they can understand they are valuable. So this is a process that's very much ongoing. We have many young women. This was taken quite recently of an intake of 10. Sometimes we'll go to the airport and pick up as many as 10 that are all scheduled to come in. They have all escaped wearing whatever they were wearing and have arrived back in Phnom Penh for us. Phnom Penh is the capital of Cambodia. We also deal with men, many of them sold to the fishing industry. I don't have time to get into all the stories there, but to give you just a thumbnail sketch, this is a very, very violent form of slavery where young men are sold onto fishing vessels and they think it's a job. They think they're going to get shore leave. They think they're going to get pay. They think they're going to have cell phones to talk to their families. That is not the case. They are quarantined on the vehicle, on the vessels, and not allowed off. And some of them do years on those vessels. We have one client quite recently who, when they got close enough to shore, he jumped and swam for his life. He was 17 years old when he was sold onto those vessels. And when he finally escaped, he was 37. 20 years of slavery, where men are executed routinely, just as a form of discipline. They just throw them overboard and shoot them. Where they are beaten, where they are worked 7 days a week, where they sexually service senior crew, etc. And there is no choice. It is absolutely a horrifying industry. And yet young lives come out of that. In his case, older lives. He was 37 when he finally escaped. Comes back to Cambodia. Now we have the protocols to work with them, the immigration protocols to get them in and through and into our program. And this is one of my favorite pictures of a bunch of men in our program learning to calm themselves after the trauma, learning to close their eyes and recognize they are still safe in a room with others. They are skittish is an understatement. They're used to looking over their shoulder after having been constantly beaten and abused. And so it's quite a thing for them to be able to learn to trust others in a room and even close their eyes and listen to their pulse and calm themselves. The whole context for this, obviously, is that you are valuable. You are profoundly valuable. You are not a throwaway human being, which is a wonderful thing to be able to do in missions. That, too, leads to job skills training, in this case, air conditioning installation and repair, and right into healthy and appropriate jobs and dignity for them as they reintegrate back with families or build new families after the trauma. So what started for us as a dream of helping just a few Cambodians has turned into something much more extensive. We have Cambodia here, and we're returning people by international agreements from all over, and it's a wonderful and a very exciting process. But it's overwhelming. I don't think any of us feel skilled to do this. I don't think any of us feel that we're on top of this. But this is what God requires us to do, and so we jump in wherever possible, and He has blessed us with hundreds being set free as a result. So where we stand right now, as a small organization based in Canada, we have staff embedded right into the Ministry of Social Services in Cambodia, young Cambodian staff, young Christians who step up into meetings and negotiate for these lives, negotiate for changes in policy, in law, in immigration, and they are doing so successfully. What an amazing thing it is to see young Cambodian women such as Pise, who's one of our managers, negotiating head-to-head with government officials and being well received and respected to the point where the government want more assistance. And they ask for more input, and they ask for training. What a joy to bring Christian principles of dignity and human value to the table in a very secular government, in a government of a country that is quite unlike ours. So in the context of that whole administration, there's kind of the warm, fuzzy trauma counseling stuff, where you're actually face-to-face with a brutalized person, expressing value to them and hope to them. But there's also a whole administrative side. And this is another thing we're bringing to the table, where we have developed software data management for managing human trafficking victims, where they're at in terms of their immigration coming back, their treatment in terms of medical, their psychological care, their job skills training, the police investigations that are going on regarding their trafficking, because we do work with the Cambodian police on that too. Ministry of Social Services is obviously heavily involved, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in terms of getting them back. There's a lot of moving parts here. And God has positioned us in such a way as to develop a computer program that actually manages all of this stuff. And so this is a tool that can be offered as a gift to other NGOs and to government in terms of the role and workload of individual counselors vis-a-vis the clients, the young trafficking victims, and where we are with them, the jobs that need to be done, our workload, etc. As well as a means by which we can geographically track. So we can click on any given province, get the number of stats for how many victims there are we're working with, what jobs are actually overdue in terms of their counseling schedules and whatever else we need to get to, the various stats. This is preserving our staff too in terms of workload, because it's overwhelming. So there's a whole way of monitoring human trafficking recovery, which has never been done before, which is really, really exciting. So we're dealing with so many different aspects of this. First of all, actually freeing individual lives that can be transformed. We're sitting across a desk or sitting in a counseling room with them, speaking love and hope into their lives. We are also in a position to deal with the larger systems within which young people have been exploited, both nationally and internationally, and having a real impact on human trafficking in regards to that, with the Cambodian government as full partners, or rather we're supporters of them, because they're a sovereign state, and part of our ministry really is to honor and recognize that we are guests in that country and serve the Cambodian government as best we can and be a witness to them. That's been tremendously well received, because many international organizations dislike the host government they work with. They don't trust them because they're not Christian, they're not necessarily ethical, they're not whatever. We've gone the opposite direction in saying that this is a sovereign country and we need to honor the leadership and be a blessing to them too and minister to them. So we have many meetings and relationships with senior government officials, and we seek to bless and encourage them as well. And that has paid off both in terms of individual relationships, but also in terms of working with those that have been trafficked, the lowest of the low in society, coming back with no real identity. So it's been a really, really exciting process, but yes, overwhelming. So, what's the lens through which we view all this? Well, obviously the lens with which we have to view this is God, and what is His desire for justice? It's very clear in Scripture He is driven for justice. This is a characteristic of Him. He demands it of us. But you can see in my story, being a dyslexic kid with the kind of kid that was bullied frequently, who ends up being a weapons specialist with no skills whatsoever useful to God, you'd think. God chooses to use me simply because I was willing. And I think that's the most important thing you have to offer to the God who demands justice of us, is are you willing to offer whatever you have to Him? Chances are your skills are going to be a lot more applicable than a weapons specialist who deals with dead people, or a dyslexic kid that still can't spell, or whatever. Chances are you have real skills that you may not think are applicable, but I would encourage you to offer those to the Lord. He uses the weak. He uses precisely our struggles. It's those negatives in our life. We talk about this, in our weakness, God's strength is revealed. We throw that comment away all the time. It's real. Because if I was relying on my certifications and my qualifications and my expertise and my skills, that's exactly what I'd be relying on. It's when I'm outside the box, when I don't feel I have the skills, when I'm overwhelmed, that I truly come before Him and say, Lord, you better show up. I suddenly become dependent when I don't feel capable. And in some ways, that's exactly where God wants us. God wants us to be vulnerable enough to put ourselves in the position that we have to rely on Him. And so often our weaknesses, our struggles, dyslexia for me with a visual memory, I can memorize evidence, I can memorize crime scenes, I can recognize rooms in which children have been abused or people have been trafficked. I can do that forensic work. God has given me a brain that works that way. What a gift that I never saw coming from dyslexia. So all the struggles you have, all the issues you think, oh my goodness, this so limits me in terms of my outreach, my faith, my ability to influence others. Those are the very things, if given to God, that He will say, I will use those. You don't know how, I don't know how yet, but offer Him your weaknesses. They are far more important, I believe, that you offer those to Him than offering Him your strengths. He knows all about your strengths. He'll use those when the time's right. The weakness is what He really wants in your life. So He also uses unlikely others. For us, the Cambodian government, even the Cambodian police. There are wonderful Cambodian police officers that people kind of are a little shocked when they even discover that there are Cambodian police that I'm very fond of. Yeah, they're not all bad. And so God can bring in people that are at times very non-Christian, very other culture, to be our allies in this. And that is all part of our ministry as Christians, to reach out and build bridges with them and say, you too are a partner, we honor you. So think very much about those around you who are the sort of the unexpected, unlikely others that have been certainly central in terms of the ministry we do. So in terms of God's character, the issue of justice is front and center for Him. There are so many Bible verses that apply to this. I'm just going to give you two. Isaiah 1:17, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless. That's plead. I missed a P there. Plead the case of the widow. So this is a demand. There is nothing in here that says this is a polite little suggestion you might want to consider. Everything here demands. It is a command to do so. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed. There's no option for us here. So the bar is high. We can't kind of weasel our way out of this. The demands are very, very high that God gives us. Here's another one from Isaiah. This is one of my favorites. The Lord looked and was displeased that there was no justice. He saw that there was no one. He was appalled that there was no one to intervene. So this is sort of an exciting two-part, chapter 59, verses 15b and 16a. The Lord looked and was displeased. So what displeased the Lord? The lack of justice, because that is part of His character. It is the sin of the world that means there's no justice, and that displeases Him. But what is it that appalls Him? What appalls Him was that no one was there to intervene. That's you and I. That's a very frightening verse, because that speaks to how God views us, those who say we know Him, those who say we're concerned about justice in the world. He was appalled that no one was intervening. So that sets the bar really, really high. And if you're like me, you're sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, what do I do with that? I don't have the skills. I don't have the ability. I don't have what it takes to do this in the face of a God that demands it. What are we to do with that? So let me encourage you with some very simple truths that I have discovered over the years. First of all, big one, and this is very countercultural, even in the church community, God never requires success. This word success is an interesting word. It's something that we presume in our mission planning, in our church planning, even in our education. We presume success. We work towards success. I'm not saying you don't work towards it, but God never requires it. He never requires it. He requires, number two, He requires we do our best. That's it. He lowers the bar incredibly. He says, you do your best, because it's not about us. It's all about him. The guy who actually changes lives is him. So I've had to allow myself the freedom to not worry about number one. And it really is freeing. And focus on number two. That's what God requires. He requires that we do our best. And then out of that, given that it's about him and not us, he shows up and he does tremendous things. Because this is about our weakness and what we offer him, the weakness, and what he brings to the table is his strength. That's what we talk about, but that's how it's actually applied. So we bring our weaknesses to him and say, I don't know if this is going to work, but I am going to do my very best. Irrespective of what happens, you may give me great success, you may not give me great success, I am going to do my best. That is my offering, and that's what the Lord runs with. And so it is a joy for me to have seen how the weaknesses and the turmoil I had in my younger life, my professional skill set that appears useless, all those things that would just appear, could be completely irrelevant to God's ministry. He says, I will take those and I will use every one of them. And so I would encourage you to do the same. Offer him not what you aspire to have, offer him what you are now. Offer him the current skills you have. Offer him your failures. Do your best before him and see what he does with it. That is the God we serve. And that is the God of justice who wants to see you thrive, even in such environments. Thanks.